The laughter started before she even reached the porch of the general store. It rolled through the dusty air of the small frontier town like a cruel wind. Light at first, then louder, sharper, bouncing off the walls of the saloon and the post office across the dirt road. She had learned to walk through it, chin up, steps slow, shoulders tight. But that afternoon, under the wide western sky that hung heavy with sun and grit, something about it burned deeper than usual. She wasn't the sort who liked attention. In a place like Cedar Ridge, where every whisper traveled faster than a rider on horseback, being different meant living under a microscope. Her difference was simple enough. She was tall. Too tall, they said, for a woman. Taller than most of the men who tipped their hats at others but kept theirs down when she passed. They called her Beanpole, Sky Watcher, or worse, pretending it was just teasing. But she saw the smirks that came after. The town had its rhythm, its rules. Men worked the cattle drives. Women baked pies and raised children. And gossip was as natural as dust settling on the fence rails. Life wasn't unkind to everyone, but for her it never seemed to soften. Even when she smiled, and she rarely did, there was always someone ready to cut it short with a joke about how her smile could be seen from a mile away. That day, she had come into town to sell the last of her mother's quilted blankets. The ranch had seen better days, and since her father passed, she was doing what she could to keep things running. She carried herself with quiet grace, though every step felt heavier under the weight of stairs. Children pointed, women whispered, and men laughed from their chairs outside the saloon, boots propped up, eyes squinting behind cigar smoke. But she kept walking, because that's what she did. She endured. Across the street, a man leaned against a hitching post, hat tilted low, watching her. He was new to town, had come riding in just 2 weeks before with a bay horse and a silence that said he'd seen more than most could imagine. Folks said he worked cattle up north and came down to help at one of the ranches after a bad storm ruined fences and scattered herds. He wasn't one to join in the laughter. He just stood there, rough hands resting on his belt, gaze steady, jaw strong, as if measuring something only he could see. She didn't notice him at first. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, her mind on what she'd lost and what she still had to do before sunset. But when she reached the porch and heard one of the ranch hands call out, "Careful, folks, she might trip on a cloud," the sound of laughter tore through her again, louder, crueler. Something in her chest clenched tight. She froze, her hands gripping the basket she carried. Her throat burned, but she didn't speak, and then the laughter stopped. It didn't fade slowly. It just ended, cut off like a rope snapped in half. She looked up, confused. The same men who'd been laughing now stared, their smirks gone. The quiet came so sudden that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And that's when she saw him, standing just a few feet away. Hat still low, boots coated in trail dust, a shadow from the brim cutting across his face. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, the kind of step that made others move aside without knowing why. The scent of leather and horses filled the air, and when he reached her, he didn't speak. He just stood there for a moment, eyes meeting hers, steady, calm, unflinching. Then, without asking permission or saying a word, he reached up, tilted his head slightly, and pressed his lips to her forehead. Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one had ever done that. Not for her. For a moment, the world stilled. The laughter, the heat, the sting, all of it vanished, replaced by something she couldn't name. She didn't move, couldn't even breathe. The touch was gentle, respectful, yet carried a weight that silenced everyone around. It wasn't a kiss of pity. It was something deeper, something that said he saw her when no one else did. When he stepped back, his eyes didn't leave hers. There was something in his look, a quiet defiance, a message to everyone watching that said enough. Then just as quick, he turned and started toward his horse. But the silence didn't last. The whispers came next, low and sharp. The men muttered, the women exchanged looks, and someone hissed, "Who does he think he is?" Another said, "Maybe he's lost his mind." But through it all, she stood frozen on that porch, one hand still gripping her basket, the other trembling slightly. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the dusty road. She wanted to speak, to call after him, to ask why he'd done it. But the words wouldn't come. All she could do was watch as he mounted his horse, the saddle creaking softly. Before he rode off, he looked back once, gave a faint nod, and said the first words she'd ever heard from him. "Don't let him make you small." Then he tugged his reins and rode westward, toward the sinking light. That night she didn't sleep much. The kiss played over in her mind again and again, every detail etched deep, the warmth of his hand, the sound of his boots, the way the laughter had died the moment he stepped forward. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something else, something unfamiliar but stirring. A spark of dignity, maybe, or hope. By morning the town was buzzing. Some called it scandal. Others said it was a joke gone too far. The preacher's wife declared it improper, and the ranch hands laughed behind their mugs of coffee, pretending they didn't care. But every time she stepped outside her small cabin on the edge of town, she could feel their eyes follow her. For the first time, though, she didn't lower her head. There was a change in the air, a sense that something was shifting. That kiss had cracked something open, not just in her, but in the way people looked at her. Some still laughed, but others didn't. Maybe they were wondering if they'd misjudged her all along. Maybe they were afraid to look foolish now that someone had dared to stand beside her. A few days passed before she saw him again. He was fixing a fence near the riverbank, sleeves rolled up, sunlight glinting off the sweat on his arms. She thought of walking over, of asking him why he'd done it, but something held her back, not fear but uncertainty. What if it had meant nothing to him? What if he'd done it out of pity? She watched him work for a while, his movements calm and sure. He never looked her way, but once, when he paused to wipe his brow, she thought she saw a faint smile tug at his mouth, as if he knew she was there. That night, thunder rolled across the plains. A storm gathered, wild and unbroken, shaking the windows of her cabin. She sat by the fire, thinking about the life she'd been living, the one filled with silence, with swallowed words and hidden pain. And then she thought of that kiss, that small, brave act that had stopped a town in its tracks. Somewhere deep inside, she felt something awaken. By morning, when the storm passed, she knew things would never be the same. People would talk. They always did. But now when they did, she wouldn't walk faster or bow her head. She would meet their eyes and let them see that she wasn't ashamed. Still, she couldn't shake the question that lingered like a ghost. What had made him do it? When she saw him next, she decided she'd ask. But she didn't know that the answer he'd give would change everything she thought she knew about herself, and about him. And as the sun rose over Cedar Ridge that morning, lighting the wet ground and quiet streets, she stepped out onto her porch with her heart beating a little faster, unaware that this was the day everything would begin. The next morning broke soft and golden over the plains, the smell of damp earth hanging in the air after the storm. The wooden boards of her porch still glistened with dew, and a thin mist clung to the fields beyond. She stood there quietly, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, watching the faint trail of smoke rise from the town below. Everything looked peaceful, but her heart carried the restless hum of what had happened days ago. The cowboy's words, "Don't let 'em make you small," still echoed inside her, as if the wind itself whispered them when it passed through the dry grass. She had lived in Cedar Ridge her whole life. Born in a small cabin on the edge of the valley, she'd grown up watching her father mend fences, brand cattle, and speak little but mean every word he said. Her mother had been gentle, soft-voiced, and strong in her own quiet way. But both were gone now. Her father buried out near the cottonwoods, her mother just 2 winters after him. Since then, the ranch had been hers to keep alive. The cattle were few, the fences old, and the land unforgiving, but she worked it as best she could. Alone. It wasn't the work that made her weary. It was the eyes. The looks that followed her when she came into town, the whispers that never quite died out. Being tall might not sound like much, but in a place like Cedar Ridge, where folks didn't like things out of the ordinary, it made her stand out like a flag in the wind. The other women her age were small and sweet-spoken, the kind who covered their mouths when they laughed. She wasn't that way, and she didn't try to be. The memory of that day outside the general store kept replaying in her mind. The laughter, the sudden silence, and that unexpected kiss on her forehead. It hadn't been romantic in the way stories in old dime novels were. It was something deeper, respectful, protective. But it stirred something in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. Something like being seen. She hadn't seen the cowboy since, but she knew he was still in town. Word spread fast in Cedar Ridge, and she'd overheard some men say he was working out at the Miller Ranch helping fix fences and tend to the herd. They said he didn't talk much, just worked hard and kept to himself. Some thought he was running from something. Others said he was just a man tired of noise and people. By the third morning, her curiosity won. She saddled up her horse, a calm gray mare named Willow, and rode toward the north pasture under the wide blue sky. The grass was high from spring rain, swaying in the breeze. She didn't know what she'd say when she saw him, but she knew she needed to understand. No man had ever stood up for her before, much less in front of the whole town. When she reached the Miller ranch, she spotted him near the fence line, hammering a post into the ground. He looked the same as before. Dust on his boots, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, hat tilted low against the sun. For a moment she just watched him work, trying to piece together who he was. The steadiness in his movements, the way he didn't seem to hurry, told her he was a man used to long days in silence. He noticed her before she spoke. Straightening up, he wiped his brow and nodded. "Morning," he said simply, voice low and steady. "Morning," she replied, her fingers tightening around the reins. She hesitated, unsure how to begin. "I wanted to thank you for what you did the other day." He looked at her then, eyes calm, unreadable. "Didn't do much," he said after a pause. "You stopped them," she said softly. "They've been laughing at me since I was old enough to walk into town. You made them stop." He studied her for a long moment, then leaned against the fence post, crossing his arms. "Didn't stop 'em for good," he said. "Just made 'em think twice, but that's all it takes sometimes." She wanted to ask him why he'd done it, why he'd cared, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she said, "Most folks wouldn't risk being laughed at too." His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. "I've been laughed at before. Don't bother me much." There was a quiet between them then, broken only by the rustle of wind through the grass and the faint creak of the fence. She could feel his calmness, the kind that came from a man who'd spent years alone with his thoughts. After a while, she asked, "Where are you from?" "South of here." "Near the border," he answered, eyes drifting toward the horizon. "Used to ride with a cattle outfit. Storm hit last winter, lost near everything. Been drifting since, drifting." The words settled heavy in the air. She wondered what he'd lost. Maybe family, maybe friends, maybe a piece of himself. They talked a little longer, small things, mostly about the weather and the land, but each word felt like it carried weight. When she finally turned to leave, he said quietly, "Folks in town don't know what to make of you. That's their problem. Don't let it become yours." She didn't answer right away. She just nodded, her heart thudding in her chest. As she rode home, the wind tugged at her hair, and the sunlight caught the edge of the hills in gold. Something about that conversation stayed with her. He was a man of few words, but every one of them lingered. The days that followed carried a strange stillness. The laughter in town hadn't returned, not like before, but she could feel eyes on her every time she walked down Main Street. The women whispered in corners. The men fell silent when she passed. Yet there was something different in their silence now. It wasn't scorn. It was curiosity, maybe even respect. Still, not everyone approved. The preacher's wife came by one afternoon, clutching her Bible, and warned her about keeping company with strangers. She smiled politely but said nothing. After the woman left, she sat by the window, watching the sun dip low over the plains, and wondered why kindness was something folks feared when it didn't fit their expectations. By the end of the week, she saw him again, this time in town, outside the blacksmith's. He was helping a boy load tools onto a wagon. When he caught sight of her, he gave a nod, that same quiet acknowledgement that said more than words. She wanted to approach, to talk again, but the crowd around made her pause. Still, the moment their eyes met, it felt like something unspoken passed between them, something that made her heart steady itself against the uncertainty that had always followed her. That night, as she brushed down her mare, she caught sight of the distant lights of the Miller ranch flickering across the valley. She wondered what he did after the workday ended, whether he sat by a fire like she did, whether he thought about the people who'd judged him too. A few nights later, someone knocked on her door. It was nearly dark, and the wind had picked up again. She opened it to find one of the Miller boys standing there, holding his hat nervously. "Ma'am," he said, "there's been an accident. One of the men's horses got loose down by the creek. They said they might need help." Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and lantern and followed him out into the night. The sky was heavy with clouds, the moon barely visible. When they reached the creek, she saw the cowboy kneeling beside an injured horse. Mud splattered across his clothes. His hands were steady, his voice calm as he tried to soothe the frightened animal. She knelt beside him without a word and handed him her lantern. Together they worked in silence, their movements careful and sure. After a long struggle, they managed to pull the horse free from the tangle of roots. He looked at her, breathing hard, and for a moment the light from the lantern caught his face, tired, scarred, and somehow gentle. "You didn't have to come," he said quietly. "You'd have done the same for me," she answered. He smiled then, the first real one she'd seen from him, maybe. When the horse was safe and the others had gone, they stood by the creek, listening to the sound of water moving through the dark. She wanted to ask him again why he'd kissed her that day, but something told her the time wasn't right. Instead, he said, almost to himself, "Funny thing about this place. Folks laugh at what they don't understand, till something reminds them to look twice." She turned toward him. "And what do you think they saw that day?" He looked at her then, eyes deep and steady. Maybe they finally saw the kind of woman who don't break easy. Her heart caught in her throat. Before she could answer, thunder rumbled far off in the distance, and he reached to take the lantern from her hand. "You should head back before the storm hits." She wanted to stay, to ask more, but she nodded and mounted her horse. As she rode away, she glanced back once. He was still standing there, framed by the faint glow of the lantern, watching her go. That night, as rain pattered softly on her roof, she lay awake wondering what had brought him to Cedar Ridge, and what secrets he carried behind that quiet gaze. Somewhere deep down, she knew his story was tangled with hers now, whether either of them wanted it or not. And though she didn't yet know how or why, she could feel it. Something was coming. Something that would test every bit of strength she'd ever learned to hide. The days after the storm brought a strange quiet over Cedar Ridge. The air felt heavier, the people warier. Even the horses in the pastures seemed restless, their ears flicking toward some sound only they could hear. She could feel it too, an unease, something building beneath the surface. Ever since that night by the creek, her mind kept drifting back to the cowboy. She tried to keep busy, fixing the barn roof and tending to her small herd, but the memory of his words and the way he'd looked at her lingered like a warmth she couldn't shake. Still, she knew better than to get caught dreaming. Out here, dreams didn't last long. By the end of the week, news began to spread. Someone had been stealing cattle. At first, folks thought it was rustlers passing through, but then one of the Miller boys swore he'd seen a man on horseback late at night near the south pasture, and his description wasn't kind. "Tall fella, quiet sort, keeps to himself," he said. That was all it took. By the next morning, whispers had turned sharp, and more than a few eyes in town started turning toward the cowboy. She heard it at the general store, standing in line for feed. The blacksmith's wife was saying it plain as day. "You can't trust a man who won't say where he came from. Shows up out of nowhere, and next thing you know, cattle's missing. I'd keep my doors locked, that's all I'm saying." The words stung more than she expected. She wanted to speak up, to defend him, but she stayed silent. The people of Cedar Ridge didn't take kindly to anyone who went against the grain. And though she was used to being the subject of gossip, this time it cut deeper, because it wasn't about her. It was about the one person who had shown her kindness when no one else dared. That evening, she found herself riding toward the Miller ranch again, the sky burning red behind the hills. When she reached the fence line, he was there, working quietly, as if he hadn't heard the talk. But when she dismounted, he looked up and she saw the weariness in his eyes. "People are saying things," she said softly. He nodded once. "I know." "They don't have proof," she added quickly, her voice trembling slightly. He set his tools down, brushing dust from his hands. "They don't need proof. Folks around here only need a story that fits." She looked at him, heart tightening. "You could leave before this gets worse." He gave a small shake of his head. "Running don't fix what people believe. It just makes them think they were right." Something in the way he said it told her he'd lived through this before, that Cedar Ridge wasn't the first town to turn its back on him. She wanted to ask what had happened, what he'd done or lost, but the look in his eyes stopped her. They stood there for a while, the wind carrying the smell of the plains, the faint sound of cattle lowing in the distance. Finally, he said, "You shouldn't be seen talking to me. Folks already talk enough." She straightened, her voice firm. "Let them. They've talked about me all my life. I'm still here." That earned her a faint smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "You're stronger than you think." "Maybe I learned that from someone," she said quietly. He didn't answer, but the look he gave her was enough. Later that night, as she walked her property, she noticed something strange. Hoof prints near the back fence. Fresh ones. They weren't from her mare. The shoes were heavier, the pattern different. Her heart started to pound. Someone had been there. She followed the tracks until they vanished into the dark brush near the creek. The air felt colder there, the silence thicker. She turned back uneasy and decided she'd tell him in the morning. But when morning came, he was gone. The Miller ranch hand said he'd ridden out before sunrise, said he'd taken nothing but his horse and a bedroll. Some believed he'd run because he was guilty. Others said he'd gone looking for the real rustlers. She didn't know what to believe. But deep down, something in her refused to think him a thief. The following days were filled with suspicion. The sheriff started asking questions, riding from ranch to ranch, checking fences, talking to everyone. When he came to her place, he was polite enough, but his eyes searched everything. "You seen that drifter lately?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not since 2 days ago," the sheriff's brow furrowed. "You sure about that? He seemed to take a liking to you." She met his gaze without flinching. "Doesn't mean he's a criminal," he sighed, tipping his hat. "I hope you're right, miss. But men like him usually bring trouble behind him. Be careful who you trust." After he left, she felt the weight of his warning settle in her chest. Maybe he was right. Maybe the cowboy did carry trouble wherever he went. But even if he did, she couldn't bring herself to believe he'd done wrong. There had been something honest in his eyes, something too raw to fake. That night she couldn't sleep. The sound of the wind outside her cabin kept her awake, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote howled. She thought of him out there, alone, somewhere on the trail, with no one to defend his name. The next morning, she made a decision. She packed a small satchel, saddled Willow, and rode out toward the northern hills where the old cattle routes ran. If he was searching for the real thieves, he'd be following that path. The land stretched wide and empty, dotted with scrub and dry creek beds. She rode for hours, her eyes scanning the horizon. By late afternoon, she saw smoke rising near a ridge. She rode closer, heart hammering, until she spotted him, sitting by a small fire, his horse grazing nearby. Relief washed through her, followed by anger. "You could have told me you were leaving," she said, pulling her horse to a stop. He looked up, surprised but calm. "Didn't figure anyone would miss me." "Well, you were wrong." Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "The sheriff's looking for you. They all think you did it." He poked at the fire with a stick, eyes distant. "Let 'em. Truth don't count for much in towns like that." She dismounted, her boots crunching against dry grass. "What are you really doing out here?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Trying to set something right." When she didn't respond, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of torn cloth. It was branded with a ranch mark, but not the Millers. It belonged to the Carson Ranch, miles south of town. "Found this near the tracks. Someone's been moving cattle across the ridge after dark, using the storm as cover. So you're trying to catch them?" He nodded. "They're driving the herds west toward the old canyon trail. If I can track them, maybe I can prove I didn't take anything." She stared at the cloth, then at him. "You can't do this alone." He met her gaze. "Ain't got much choice." She hesitated, then said, "Then I'm helping." He started to protest, but she cut him off. "You helped me when no one else would. You didn't ask if it was smart, you just did it. So don't tell me to stay behind now." There was silence between them for a long time, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Finally, he sighed. "You're stubborn," she smiled faintly. "So I've been told." That night, they camped under the stars, the fire throwing soft light across their faces. He told her a little about his past, how he'd once worked as a foreman for a large ranch down south, how a storm and a betrayal had ruined him, left him wandering. She listened quietly, realizing how much pain lay beneath his calm exterior. When dawn came, they set out along the ridge. The air was cool, the sky streaked with pale orange. As they rode through the open land, she felt something shift between them. A shared purpose, a fragile trust built on silence and survival. But as they neared the canyon, they saw smoke again, thicker this time, rising from behind the rocks. He motioned for her to stop and dismounted, moving ahead quietly. She followed, her heart pounding. When they peered over the ridge, they saw 3 men gathered around a small herd, their horses restless, their movements hurried. "Rustlers." He turned to her, voice low. "Stay here," she grabbed his arm. "You can't take them alone." He looked at her, his expression calm but serious. "I've faced worse." Before she could answer, one of the men below shouted. They'd been spotted. Everything erupted at once, shouting, the thunder of hooves, the flash of gunmetal glinting in the morning light. He pushed her behind a boulder, eyes sharp. "Get to your horse, now!" But she didn't move. She watched as he stepped out from cover, his hand near his holster, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Don't do something you'll regret," he warned. The men laughed, circling him slowly. One spat on the ground and sneered, "You should have stayed gone." "Cowboy!" And then, before anyone could stop it, the sound of a gunshot split the air. The echo rolled across the canyon, fading into the distance. She froze, breath caught in her chest, eyes searching through the smoke. Somewhere below, someone fell, and as the wind carried the sound of frightened cattle scattering into the hills, she knew this was only the beginning. The gunshot echoed across the canyon like thunder tearing through stone. For a moment she couldn't tell who had fired or who had fallen. The world seemed to stand still, holding its breath. The air filled with dust and panic, horses whinnying, boots pounding on loose gravel. She gripped the rock beside her, her nails digging into the dry surface as she leaned forward, searching through the haze. The cowboy stood his ground below, hat shadowing his eyes, revolver still holstered at his side. Across from him, one of the rustlers had dropped to a knee, clutching his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. "Stay back," the cowboy called, his voice carrying through the canyon. His tone was calm but sharp, the kind that could slice through chaos. The other two men froze, hands twitching near their belts, unsure if they should draw or run. She wanted to shout for him, tell him to get out of there, but fear held her silent. Every sound, the scrape of boots, the creak of leather, the distant call of a hawk, seemed louder than it should be. "You think you can play hero?" one of the rustlers spat. He was older, with a scar running down the side of his face. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The cowboy's eyes didn't flinch. "I know enough," the man snarled and reached for his gun. Before he could pull the trigger, the cowboy fired once, the sound cracking sharp against the canyon walls. The man's gun flew from his hand, clattering onto the rocks. The next moment silence returned, thick and heavy. "Pick him up," the cowboy said to the last rustler, motioning toward his injured friend. "And tell your boss to stay out of Cedar Ridge." The rustler hesitated, eyes darting toward his fallen companion, then toward the woman on the ridge. She ducked back quickly, her heart hammering. When she looked again, the men were gone, retreating toward the south trail, leaving only dust and the faint smell of gunpowder behind. She scrambled down the slope, half sliding on loose gravel until she reached him. "You're hurt," she said, seeing the blood on his arm. "It's nothing," he said, brushing it off. His voice was steady, but she could see the tremor in his fingers. "You can't stay out here," she said. "They'll come back." He looked out toward the horizon where the rustlers had disappeared. "I'm counting on it." Her stomach tightened. "You're not talking about fighting them again." "I'm talking about ending this," he said quietly. As they rode back toward her ranch, the air felt charged, every sound sharper than before. The creak of saddles, the wind cutting through the grass, the low rumble of thunder somewhere far off. She could tell he was deep in thought, his jaw set, eyes hard. When they reached her cabin, she helped him inside, cleaning the wound on his arm. He didn't say much, only watching her work with that same calm patience that made her both nervous and comforted. "You didn't have to do that back there," she said after a while. "You could have been killed." He met her eyes. "Would have been worse to do nothing." She tied the bandage tight, her hands trembling slightly. "You're planning something, aren't you?" He didn't answer. But the silence was enough. That night she couldn't sleep. The storm rolled back over the plains, lightning flashing against the windows. Every flash reminded her of the gunshot. Every rumble of thunder sounded like hooves in the distance. She kept thinking of the way he'd stood alone in that canyon, facing down men who'd have gladly killed him. And for what? To clear his name? Or for her? She didn't know which answer scared her more. At dawn, she found him outside, tightening the saddle straps on his horse. The air was cool, the ground still damp. He looked like a man ready to ride into something he might not return from. "You're going after them," she said, voice firm. He nodded once. "They'll come for the herds again tonight. I aim to be there first. I'm coming with you." "No," he said quickly. "You've done enough." She stepped closer. "You don't get to decide that." He turned, meeting her gaze, and for a moment neither spoke. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat, carrying the faint scent of rain and wild sage. Finally he sighed. "You ride behind me. No matter what happens, you keep your distance." "Deal," she said, even though they both knew she wouldn't. They rode out just before sunset, the sky burning with streaks of red and gold. The open land stretched ahead like a sea of copper light. The cowboy's silhouette moved steady in front of her, strong and certain, even as shadows grew longer. By nightfall, they reached the outskirts of the Carson Ranch, the same mark he'd found on the stolen cattle. The place was quiet. Too quiet. A lantern glowed faintly near the corral, and somewhere inside the barn, voices murmured low. He dismounted silently, signaling for her to stay back, but she followed anyway, crouching near the fence, her breath shallow. She could see 3 men inside, the same ones from the canyon, talking to another figure, a taller man in a dark coat. The rustlers looked uneasy. The man in the coat didn't. "You were supposed to take the herd, not get chased off by some stranger," the man said coldly. "He ain't just some stranger," one of the rustlers said, rubbing his injured shoulder. "He knows how to fight." The man in the coat turned slightly, his face catching the lamplight. It was the sheriff. Her heart dropped. The cowboy must have seen it too. His eyes narrowed, his whole body tensing. "Get ready," he whispered. The sheriff's voice carried through the barn. "We'll move the cattle tonight, same as planned. The girl's place will be next. She's alone, won't put up much of a fight." The cowboy moved before she could stop him. He stepped out of the shadows, revolver drawn, voice low but clear. "That's far enough, Sheriff." The men spun around, startled. The sheriff froze, his hand hovering near his gun. "Well," he said with a dry smile, "I figured you'd come back." "Should have known better," the cowboy said. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos broke loose. One of the rustlers lunged for his rifle. The cowboy fired, the shot slamming into the post beside him. Another tried to run, but she kicked open the gate, startling the horses. They bolted, sending dust and panic everywhere. She ducked behind a trough, heart racing as the sheriff fired back. The sound of gunfire cracked through the night, echoing off the hills. She saw the cowboy move through the smoke like a shadow, every step sure, every shot deliberate. "Get to the horses," he shouted. But before she could move, the sheriff's bullet grazed her shoulder. Pain seared through her arm and she fell against the dirt, gasping. The cowboy turned at the sound, eyes wide. In that split second, the sheriff aimed again. The cowboy dove forward, tackling him to the ground. The gun went off, the flash lighting their faces. They struggled, both men locked in a desperate fight, boots kicking up dust, the sheriff snarling as he tried to pull free. "Stop!" she shouted, trying to rise, but her leg buckled beneath her. The sheriff struck the cowboy across the face with his revolver, sending him sprawling. Then he stood, aiming his gun directly at him. "This town will believe whatever I tell them," the sheriff said, his voice hard and cold. "And they'll never believe you." The cowboy wiped blood from his lip and stared up at him. "Maybe not," he said, "but they'll remember you." Before the sheriff could pull the trigger, a sudden burst of wind blew through the barn, scattering hay and knocking the lantern from its hook. It hit the ground and shattered, flames licking across the dry straw. The sheriff cursed, backing away as fire spread fast. The horses screamed, breaking through the corral. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. "Get out!" the cowboy shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. They stumbled through the smoke, coughing, the heat biting at their skin. Behind them, the barn crackled and roared. Through the haze, she saw the sheriff struggling to get up, fire curling around his boots. They made it outside just as the roof gave way with a deafening crash. The flames reached high into the night, painting the sky orange. She turned to look at him, breathless. "It's over," she said. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't. He shook his head. "Not yet." Because out there in the distance, through the rising smoke, they could see the shadow of riders coming fast. More men, more trouble. The sheriff hadn't been working alone. The cowboy stepped forward, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Get to the horses," he said quietly. "It's about to get worse." And as the night wind howled through the burning remains of the barn, she knew that whatever was coming next would decide everything. His name, her future, and the town that had tried so long to break them both. The riders came out of the smoke like ghosts, their horses pounding across the open ground, eyes glowing in the firelight. The cowboy stood in front of her, his hand steady on his revolver, his breath even. The night air burned hot from the flames, and the ground trembled under the thunder of hooves. She could see the glint of guns, the shadows of men too far gone in greed to care about what was right or wrong. "Get behind me," he said without turning. She didn't argue this time. Her shoulder ached from the wound, but she kept her grip tight on the reins. The fire from the barn threw long orange streaks across the field, painting everything in flickering light. The riders slowed as they approached, spreading out like wolves circling their prey. "Drop your gun," one of them called. "You're outnumbered." The cowboy's voice came low and calm. "You boys picked the wrong night." For a heartbeat, everything stilled. Then a single shot cracked the silence, and chaos exploded again. He fired first, his aim sharp and sure. One rider tumbled from his saddle. Another's horse reared and bolted. The rest spread, shouting, their shots echoing through the dark. She ducked behind a fallen beam, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. He moved like a man who'd fought his whole life, every motion deliberate, fearless. Smoke curled around him, the flashes of gunfire lighting his face in brief, harsh bursts. When one rider came too close, he grabbed him by the coat and yanked him to the ground, sending him crashing into the dirt. It felt endless, the heat, the noise, the fear. But then it was over. The remaining men broke off, vanishing into the darkness as fast as they'd come. The cowboy stood alone in the open, the fire reflecting off his eyes. His chest rose and fell heavily. She ran to him, the smell of smoke thick in her lungs. "You're hurt," she said, seeing the blood on his side. He shook his head, steadying himself on his horse. "Just a scratch." Behind them, the fire had begun to die down, leaving the barn a blackened shell. The sheriff's body lay near the wreckage, the flames finally still. The sound of approaching hooves came again, not from enemies this time, but from the town. Lanterns glowed in the distance as men from Cedar Ridge rode up, drawn by the smoke and gunfire. When they arrived, they found her standing beside the cowboy, both covered in dust and ash, the truth written in their eyes. The first man to dismount was the blacksmith, his face pale with disbelief. "What happened here?" She spoke quietly, her voice hoarse. The sheriff was behind the rustling. He planned to take the herds and blame it on him. The men exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, one of them said, "We'll see to what's left." No one dared challenge her story. Not after seeing the burned barn. Not after seeing the sheriff's badge half melted in the dirt. By morning, word spread across Cedar Ridge. The sheriff was dead, the rustlers gone, and the truth, after so many lies, was finally out. The townsfolk gathered in the square, whispering among themselves. Some looked ashamed, others confused. No one laughed this time. When she and the cowboy rode into town, the street went silent. He still looked worn from the fight, but his shoulders were straight, his head high. She rode beside him, her arm still bandaged, but her spirit unbroken. The blacksmith stepped forward first, clearing his throat. "We misjudged you, stranger." "All of us." The cowboy nodded once. "You just saw what you were told to see." Then his gaze swept the crowd, stopping on her for a moment. "Same way you did with her." A few people looked down at their boots. Others murmured apologies that didn't quite find the strength to be spoken. She didn't need to hear them. Their silence said enough. Over the next few days, life in Cedar Ridge began to settle again. The smoke cleared, the air grew still, and the land started to heal. But something had changed. Folks greeted her differently now, some with nods, others with quiet respect. The laughter that used to sting her every time she walked into town was gone. She spent most of her days tending her ranch, repairing the damage from the storm, and nursing her shoulder back to strength. The cowboy stayed nearby, helping where he could but never saying much about what came next. He'd built a small camp near the ridge, close enough that she could see his fire at night. Sometimes he'd ride into town for supplies. Sometimes he'd come by her place to help mend fences or move the cattle. There were still quiet moments between them, moments where words weren't needed. She'd find herself glancing at him across the pasture, wondering if he'd ever stop drifting, if he'd ever choose to stay. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky turned soft with gold, he came to her porch. He had that same calm look he'd worn since the day she met him. But there was something different in his eyes now. Peace. Maybe. They'll need a new sheriff, he said, looking out toward the town. She nodded. Someone honest this time? He smiled faintly. Maybe. But honest men don't always last long in places like this. She stepped closer. Neither do kind ones. They stood there in the quiet, the sound of crickets filling the air. Finally, she asked what had lingered in her mind since that day at the general store. "Why'd you do it?" "That day when you kissed my forehead in front of everyone?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because they needed to see what respect looks like. And you needed to be reminded what you're worth." The words struck deep, simple, and true. She felt her throat tighten, her heart catching against her ribs. For years she'd walked through life trying to shrink herself, trying not to be noticed. But he'd seen her differently. Not as someone too tall, too odd, too quiet, but as someone unbroken. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "You could stay, you know. The ranch could use another hand." He looked out toward the open land, the fading sun glinting off his hat brim. "I've been running a long time," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time I stopped," she smiled. "There's plenty of room here if you want to." He didn't answer right away, but when he looked at her again, the warmth in his eyes said enough. The days turned slower after that. The land began to green again with spring, and laughter returned to the town. But this time it wasn't cruel. The children who once pointed at her now waved when she rode by. The women at the store spoke to her kindly, and even the men who'd once sneered now tipped their hats. Cedar Ridge wasn't perfect, it never would be, but something about it had softened. Maybe people had learned something about judgment, about how easy it is to mistake quiet strength for weakness. As for her and the cowboy, they worked side by side through the seasons that followed. He built a small corral near the edge of her land, where his horse grazed beside hers. Sometimes they talked about the past, sometimes about nothing at all. But most evenings ended the same way, sitting on the porch, watching the sun fall behind the hills, the light fading slow and peaceful. Every now and then, someone passing through town would ask about the sheriff who'd died in that fire, or about the stranger who'd come from nowhere and saved the town from its own lies. And folks would point toward the ranch on the ridge, saying, "That's where they live now," the cowboy and the woman everyone once laughed at. But those who knew them best never said much, because some stories didn't need telling. They just lived quietly in the wind, in the rustle of the wheat fields, in the soft rhythm of hooves across open ground. One late afternoon, when the air smelled of rain and earth, she looked at him and said, "You ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't stopped that day? If you'd just walked past me like everyone else?" He gave that small smile again, the one that still caught her by surprise. "Then I'd still be wandering," he said. "And you'd still be hiding." She reached out, resting her hand over his. "Guess we both found what we were looking for then." He squeezed her hand gently. "Maybe it wasn't what we were looking for. Maybe it's what found us." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the coming rain. She looked out over the land, the hills glowing soft under the fading sun. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel out of place in her own skin. She didn't feel too tall, too different, or too much. She felt whole. As night settled over Cedar Ridge, the firelight from their porch flickered like a promise. The town below grew quiet again, and the world seemed smaller, softer, safer. The kind of peace you only find when you've fought hard enough to earn it. And in that quiet, under a sky full of stars, the cowboy reached for her hand again, the same way he had once before in a dusty street. Steady, sure, and unafraid of who might see. This time there was no laughter, only the sound of the wind and the heartbeat of a town that had finally learned the meaning of respect.